I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference.
As a nonprofit focused on educating and empowering people to get involved in climate action, we're reliant on the financial support of our listeners. So if you're a regular listener and you value what you get from us, consider a donation that aligns with that value. All you have to do is head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button. Even $5 a month goes a huge way in helping us to deliver on our mission. And if you're short on cash, but you still want to help out, tell your friends to subscribe and rate us on your streaming platform.
Thanks, Flora. Definitely an important one. You know, we need to increase our listening base to increase our impact. So yeah, even if you don't have the cash, tell your friends about us and head over on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen and give us a good review. So today we're going to be talking about our friends to the north. You know, the country that loves ice hockey, has free healthcare, where folks still know how to be polite. You know, where everyone has a pet moose, right? Who doesn't like Canada? You know, I got to say, when doing the research for this, my folk singer favorite, Gordon Lightfoot, is from Canada. Sadly, passed away recently. But I didn't know Justin Bieber was Canadian. I guess I'm still stuck in the Stone Ages.
That one does age you a little bit, Jason, just a tiny bit.
What are you going to do? Thomas, you're a big fan of poutine, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, love it. Can't get enough of it. I don't know whether it's the potatoes or the cheesy gravy.
So, because of its northern location, Canada is also experiencing much more rapid change when it comes to the climate, from temperature rise to increasing wildfires. It's working to become a climate leader and leave its climate laggard reputation behind, but a difficult challenge given, you know, its large oil industry that's one of the dirtiest. So, before we dive into the conversation about Canada and climate, let's talk about this week's reason for hope, which is there is a climate trial that kicked off this last week in Montana. There are 16 youth plaintiffs that filed a lawsuit actually back in 2020. The wheels turn slowly. The claim alleges that state policies regarding energy run counter to the constitutional right that the state provides a clean and healthy environment. Seems pretty reasonable to me. Apparently, it's the first ever they call constitutional climate trial in the U.S. for those lawyers out there.
Yeah, I think this nonprofit law firm is behind a couple of other cases in other states as well, including one in Hawaii that may go to trial later this fall. So it's great to see a few law firms, getting behind the climate movement and worrying about doing things other than just suing Ed Sheeran for copyright violations, which he didn't do.
Yeah, there's a couple good articles in The Guardian on the topic. They're doing a pretty nice job of covering it, and we'll link those in our website. But fingers crossed they can make some progress, and you know, if nothing else, they're help laying precedent for some of these other cases and turning up the heat on the, you know, politicians that aren't willing to do the right thing.
Yeah, good stuff. So our guest today is Simon Donner, a climate scientist and professor at the University of British Columbia. He was a lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's recent Sixth Assessment Report, and he's a member of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body, which advises the federal government on pathways to eliminating climate warming emissions. Some more fun stuff about Simon, not that all wasn't fun. He's a longtime water sports enthusiast who's described by his family as an aquatic plant needing sun and water to thrive. And during the pandemic, Simon dipped into the freezing ocean near his Vancouver home every day for over a year.
That's commitment.
Huge commitment.
I think I can relate to the aquatic plant. Maybe that's what I am too, because I definitely like to spend time in water and need sun. Well, Simon, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thanks for having me here.
So to start things off, when you think about efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
Well, I hear that word hope a lot, or what makes you optimistic a lot from people ask me, students ask me, the media asks me, et cetera. And it's interesting. I'm a very hopeful and optimistic person in general. People that just know me would say that. And so because of that, I don't love the word hope when it comes to climate action. And because so much about whether somebody's optimistic or hopeful is just sort of about their own personality, not necessarily about the evidence. And so what I've sort of come to over
Sure.
the years is that it's not really about hope or optimism or pessimism, even when it comes to climate change. And that really what this is about is courage. That we
Okay.
need the planet's warming faster than at any point in the history of human civilization. And it's going to keep doing so unless we stop putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so we it's going to this is requires a huge transition or huge transformation, and so it's going to take guts, right, to shift paths. And so I like to think of it as what is going to give us the courage, what is going to give us the guts. And for me personally, there's many things, but one float always floats to the top for me is that the solutions to climate change are generally good ideas anyways, regardless of
Okay.
climate change. And the one, I mean, the most obvious one to me is just air pollution. The majority of the air pollution that affects human health around the planet, kills millions of people a year, is from burning carbon, burning fossil fuels. But if we transition away from burning coal, burning oil, et cetera, to other forms of generating energy, will eliminate a lot of air pollution and save a lot of lives. And we would also happen to solve climate change. And so it's those
Right.
co-benefits that I'm like, this is such an obvious thing to do. This is a good idea, regardless of how you feel about climate change.
I like the word courage. I think you're right. We all have to find that thing that gives us the courage to embrace the change. And I think you're right too that there's many of these solutions that have, as you say, co-benefits that make it a kind of a no-brainer. Well, since we're talking about Canada today, let's jump into, for those who live outside of it, what kinds of climate impacts are unfolding in Canada? How is climate change manifesting?
We're seeing climate change sort of in our daily lives so much in Canada over the past few years. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, but I live out here in Vancouver, British Columbia now. But the big thing to understand about Canada is that Canada's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. And
Wow.
that's not surprising. I mean, northern countries like Canada are expected to warm faster, and it's just got to do with feedback effects that happen with melting ice and a little bit of feedback effects that happen in the atmosphere. So the fact that Canada's warming faster than other parts of the world kind of confirms that sort of scientists understand some of the physics of of the planet.
Right.
But what's coming with that, and we're really seeing in the past few years, is the increase in extreme events, heat waves, droughts, fires, flooding events, and both river flooding events, but also high tide levels on the coast. And we've had some incredible, just disturbing climate disasters over the past few years. The heat wave that affected where you are in Portland, but also us here in 2021. We had a heat wave where temperatures reached almost 50 degrees Celsius in Canada, in British Columbia, in the dry part of the province. But out here on the coast, reached into the low 30s Celsius, so like into the 90s, which is just not something that happens in our pretty moderate climate of Vancouver. And as a result, 700 people died, just a little under 700 people.
Wow.
And it was sort of this reminder that, climate change was always this thing for Canadians that thought was going to affect other people more, that we'd, if anything, Canada would, people used to say Canada will benefit. We'll be able to grow things further north and the winters won't be as cold and there'll be fewer cold related deaths and sicknesses that happen. But I think we've just got a stark reminder in the past few years of just how damaging the effects of climate change can be, even in a northern country that doesn't seem like it's that hot. It's all about what you're adjusted to. And here in Vancouver, we were not prepared for that type of heat.
Yeah, I mean, 50 degrees Celsius is objectively hot no matter where you are in the
Yeah,
world,
I
let
know that. No,
alone
that was in the interior in Lytton, British Columbia. It didn't quite hit. Obviously, didn't hit that here on the coast. But it's all about what you're adapted to. And I don't know. This probably experiences somewhat similar in Portland. Very small fraction of homes and buildings in Vancouver have air conditioning. We
yeah,
certainly have
very
heating
true.
for the winter, but the temperatures just doesn't get that warm here. Most summer days usually in the 70s Fahrenheit, mid 20s Celsius. So if temperatures get into the 80s or 90s, it's uncomfortable here
Yeah.
because we're just not prepared for it.
Yeah, very, very similar in Portland. And I think, marine climates like Seattle as well. I mean, all those West Coast cities, people, especially vulnerable people, right?
We had this incredible series of sort of compound events because we had that horrible heat wave in 2021. And then a few months later, we had devastating floods that, due to basically what they call an atmospheric river, but really series of really heavy rainfall for a few days, happened a few times in a row in the fall, October, November, and led to flooding that a few people died, a lot of cattle died, a lot of people driven off of their farms and off of their homes. And the heat wave actually helped set it up, because the heat wave meant the soils were dry, a lot of trees had died. And so then when we had heavy rainfall in October and November, the soils on on all the mountains weren't ready for it. They couldn't withstand it.
I guess maybe that's a segue to another question, as we're talking about this. I mean, how are Canadians coping? How are communities coping, especially those that are really out there, and exposed to these extremes?
Obviously, just like the US, Canada is such a big country that it depends so much coast to coast. And so the thing that always worries me with the effects of climate change, but particularly climate extremes, is that everybody's very caring about it when the event happens. We have these forest fires going on. There finally has been some rain just this week that have tamped down some of the forest fires in Alberta and in eastern BC. So that'll be in the news while it's happening, but then it drops off of everybody's sort of radar
Right.
after the extreme conditions end. But if you live in one of those communities, you're dealing with it for years, right? Lytton, British Columbia was basically burned to the ground by a forest fire after the big heat wave last in 2021. And, it's going to take years to figure out how to have everybody move back to their community.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. That there's sort of the headline cycle that obviously generates or can generate a lot of flow of resources and whatnot, but or a lot of these events, you're right. You're talking years to recover from them. Well, let's talk about a little bit about Canada's main sources of emissions for folks who may not be aware. Like what are the big buckets when it comes to Canada and emissions?
So this will be no secret to Canadians, but people outside the country might not realize how big of an oil and gas producer Canada is. And as a result, oil and gas production, this isn't the consumption of it, just the emissions from producing oil and fossil gas. That's a little over a quarter of Canada's emissions. That mostly is coming from the provinces of Alberta, a little bit Saskatchewan, a little bit British Columbia. And so that's like
It's
the
huge.
highest bucket. Yeah, it's a big number. It's the highest bucket. After that is transportation, a little under a quarter of emissions. We're transporting stuff long distances here. And so after oil and gas and transportation, the next biggest one is only would be buildings, because of course we have building heating
Yeah.
is a challenge. Is obviously another big source of emissions here. We use natural or fossil gas for most of that in a lot of parts of the country. But you'll notice, like I've mentioned, oil and gas and transportation is the big ones. Buildings, there's heavy industry and everything. I didn't mention electricity. So unlike a lot of the U.S., although not all of the U.S., electricity emissions are actually quite low in Canada. It's only about 8% of our total right now. And it's
Interesting.
because we have a pretty low carbon electricity grid. Dams and hydropower dominates in some parts of the country, British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, etc. The ability to generate electricity without burning a lot of fossil fuels is, for me, the reason that Canada could really be a leader in climate change solutions, because we just have the resources to do all of this, right? Like we have the land, you know, for wind, for solar, and certainly for hydro. And so it's one place that Canada is probably a little bit distinct from what people might expect in the US or otherwise.
Yeah, very different from the US where, transportation is our largest at about a quarter, followed very closely by our electricity market, right? So let's talk about goals then. What kind of ambition has Canada set in terms of reducing its emissions?
So Canada, for Canadians, we're used to this. Canada has a long history of setting targets and not really doing anything to try to meet them. I would say that is changing now, and that there are actually plans and policies in place. But we have a target that's not as tough as the U.S. target for 2030. It's a 40 to 45% reduction below 2005 levels by the year 2030. So that's our kind of near-term target. And that was decided on leading up to the Glasgow Climate Conference a couple of years ago. That was increasing the target from a 30% reduction. But the really meaningful thing I would say that happened wasn't this interim target, but was the long-term stuff. So under our current government, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when they ran for office in the last election, they promised that they would have binding emissions targets aiming towards zero. And so shortly after being reelected, they put a bill through Parliament that said we are aiming for net zero emissions by 2050, and we are going to have legislated targets every 5 years up until then. And so we do now have that bill passed Parliament. And so we do have this goal of getting to net zero by 2050. And my involvement in this was that I was asked to serve on an advisory body to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Canada on how do we get to net zero and what should those interim targets be. And that was all set up because it's actually in the legislation that created the advisory body. And then for some reason they called me, among many other people that deserve to be there more than I do, I think so.
Well, so, sounds like maybe not quite as ambitious as the US, although I think the US has a history of making big pledges and maybe not quite reaching them.
Yeah, Canada hasn't cornered the market on that.
Sounds like targets are in line with where they need to be. Maybe tighter or a more ambitious 2030 would be nice, but Canada has the net zero, targets out there. What is it doing to meet those from a national level?
So, and this is a place where I will give our current government credit. They are taking the advice of the experts, maybe not aggressively enough, but what Canada's done, it's quite a interesting contrast with the US, right? So, under the Biden administration, passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of like a piece of industrial policy. It's just like throwing money at the industries that we think are part of the future, electric vehicles, hydrogen, et cetera, right? Canada, there is a lot of spending initiatives, but really what Canada's done is follow all the sort of policy and regulatory advice. And some of it is that we're able to pass these things.
Right.
Whereas recognizing that politically in the US, some of that stuff, it's just not politically feasible to do. So when the Trudeau government first came into office about 8 or 9 years ago, their promise was we're going to put a price on carbon, and they did. And so Canada does have a carbon price. It's not a tax technically. What the government did is they said, each province, you can come up with your own system. It can be cap and trade, it can be a tax, but whatever you do, like if you don't do it, we're going to charge you this the federal price number, and put the price on anything that's sort of burning carbon, basically. And so the provinces have different systems, and the federal government has like a backstop for the provinces that were being stubborn and didn't want to do it, basically.
Sure.
So, which was a not perfect, but I think a clever way to deal with provincial disagreements in Canada. And so we have the carbon pricing system, and that price is going up to $170 a ton by 2030. So it's going up about $15 a year. But on top of that, there's this unbelievable suite of regulations, infrastructure programs, targeted investments, that there's so many different policies and things going on at the federal level that even though I serve on a federal government advisory body, every once in a while I'll be on a call and somebody will mention something. I'm like, wait, what program is that? I've never heard of that one. And just to give you a sense of it, we have a zero emissions vehicle mandate the government's finalizing. So for passenger vehicles, have to be zero emissions sales by 2035. For medium duty vehicles by 2040. We've got a clean electricity standard that the feds are working on to get emissions from electricity to zero by 2035. We also have a clean fuel standard. So fuels that are carbon based, it's setting, California has something like this saying that we have to reduce the carbon footprint of those fuels. There's been a cap is being placed on emissions from the oil and gas sector. It's very complicated and the method hasn't been chosen quite yet, but that's in the works. There's tax credits for carbon capture and storage projects. There's a methane initiative. There's all these funding agencies for transition, a net zero accelerator, an infrastructure bank. There's a just transition plan. There's a greening government plan to get government to do things. There's like mineral strategies. Like the list is incredible. And so my only criticism of it would be that most of it doesn't quite have enough teeth. And it's a bit like some of these things we're thinking too marginally. The zero emissions vehicle mandate, the clean electricity standard, those are great. That's what we need to be doing. A lot of these other things, they're kind of playing on the edges too much,
Sure.
or they just don't have enough detail yet to know how effective the policy is going to be.
So I was aware you had a price on carbon and in the form of more of like a fee and dividend, but I didn't know about all of the underlying, legislation that you're talking about. So it sounds like there is kind of this combination of what would be called more of a market approach, where you're saying let's put a fee on the thing that we want to get rid of, and then also this regulatory approach.
And on top of all this, the government is also trying to provide incentives for companies that are in the renewable energy space or the zero emissions space, including just providing a whole bunch of money to basically a subsidy to Volkswagen, and I'm forgetting the other company, to build battery plants in Canada.
Okay.
Because there is a real concern for Canada. It's hard to compete against the market that exists for these things in other parts of the world, particularly in the US. And so the worry is we'll be moving in the right direction of climate solutions, but we'll be killing all of these Canadian industries at the same time. And so we need to make sure we're sort of building the industries in Canada as well. And so our advisory body has actually been pushing quite hard on really deliberate industrial policy around vehicles, around minerals, et cetera. And I think there are actually some good lessons from the Inflation Reduction Act on that.
So, wondering, Canada's obviously a vast country, lots of forests out there. Where do natural climate solutions kind of fit into Canada's net zero strategy?
I would say I don't know for sure on the net zero strategy, but at least for the short term, thinking about going to 2030 and everything, the government's committed to this sort of 30-30 plan, protecting 30% of land and waters by 2030 that a lot of governments in the world have signed up for. I don't think we're there yet, and so wrapped up in that is the idea that natural climate solutions can be part of solving climate change. Just we have vast forests in Canada, et cetera. I just put caution on it. This is the part of the emissions budget for the country and the proposed solutions, it's the fuzziest. Some of it is that the accounting of the emissions is hard to do in the first place, like what net uptake or net emissions from our forests and everything. And then the other thing is that we're in this, I don't feel like the US talks about this either. When studies come out and say we could do X% of the solution of the emissions, we could solve by natural climate solutions, planting forests to take up carbon out of the atmosphere, et cetera. When we're thinking about net zero, some of the path to net zero is going to involve fuels being generated from land, perhaps from
Right.
cropland, but definitely from forests in Canada. And that is because when we're looking at longer distance transportation, like transport trucks, ferries, airplanes, etc., batteries alone and electricity probably aren't going to be the solution. They might be part of it. And so we are going to need to be also using some land probably to generate fuels. And so then the challenge is those two things, the potential demand and need for biofuels in a net zero future and the natural climate solutions, those analyses are done like separately by different people. But if you put them together, they end up conflicting. I'm like, well, hold on. How are you going to get this much uptake from land via natural climate solutions if you're actually managing some of the forest land to create wood chips to create fuel out of?
Right.
And the other risk for Canada, and there's been some politics of this over the years, of course, is that saying we're going to manage our forests to uptake carbon is wonderful. What do we do about fires?
Right.
Like it's not all in our control. And so Canada, for years, under the Kyoto Protocol, used to argue that we should be able to count forced carbon uptake towards our Kyoto goal. Canada was a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. And it was interesting is that Canada was among the few countries arguing that for a long time in the Kyoto group. But then after the mountain pine beetle outbreak in Western Canada that killed a lot of pine trees and flipped the carbon budget for Western Canada from being a sink to a source, the government stopped arguing that. Right? So I just worry that natural climate solutions are important. I worry that we're promising more than is probably possible.
So, recapping here, it's like things have been bad in Canada. You're seeing these climate impacts unfold more quickly. Sounds like the government response has been fairly robust, like opportunities to, it sounds like, accelerate things, but focusing on the right stuff. And so I guess now I get question would be like, how can our listeners in Canada, or maybe our listeners just south of Canada, how can we help, with the country realizing its climate goals and net zero future?
I
I know that's not an
for
easy question to answer.
no. Yeah, it is not an easy question. For me, like for the average Canadian or the average person listening to this outside, there's so many things you can do in your own life to reduce emissions, right? Whether it's thinking about how you move around, what type of vehicle you're driving, or whether you're driving one at all, how you heat and cool your home, what type of food you eat, et cetera. Like all of these different things that you can do to reduce emissions. But I think one of the lessons we've seen over the past few years through the pandemic is that personal actions alone can't solve the problem, right? Emissions didn't go to
Right.
zero during the pandemic when people were staying at home. They decreased, but not by that much. So, what it tells us is that personal actions alone aren't enough. What we need is governments to make the incentives, right? So, it's easy to say, well, you should buy an electric vehicle, but we need government policy to make it easier for people to do that. A lot of Canadians, I think the vast majority of Canadians, are down with doing things to reduce emissions, but we need the incentive structure set to make it easier for them to make those choices, right? And the part that I find always interesting about this is that how do you send that signal? You can do it by voting, but you can also just do it by talking to your representatives, MP, Minister of Parliament, the Canadian term for it. Because one of the things I've really learned from the policy work over the past few years and working, hands on with folks in the government is that people in government don't hear from the average person in the public. The government in Canada doesn't hear from the average Canadian, nor does the US government hear from the average American. They hear from lobbyists, they hear from interest groups, they hear from activists. And that's great. But it's easy to dismiss what an activist is saying because you know that this is their whole driving force in life. It's different if everybody else in sort of the more muddled middle on this subject are also contacting their representatives. So I was like, just send a letter. Letters in particular, actual paper letters, are very influential compared to emails, for one. So just tell the government what you want to see and what you want to hear, because at some point, when they get enough letters from somebody, it means that the staff person has to tell the representative, whether it's a congressperson or a minister of parliament, listen, I'm getting a lot of letters about this from your constituents. We need to do something about it. Like, we've done research
Right.
on this. There is like a threshold beyond which it gets elevated. And so I really feel like the most important thing you can do sometimes is just communicate it. Talk about it with your elected representatives, but also tell people in your community, hey, I wrote this letter. You might want to do that as well. And so
Right.
there's sort of a grassroots mobilization that's necessary to get that top-down policy, I think.
We love the suggestion because we're big advocates of engaging with government. But it's great to hear you sort of talk about it in the lens that you do. That is, day to day, these representatives or elected officials are used to hearing from the activists or the lobbyists, and maybe not the average person. And that I think sometimes it can be easy to assume that, well, the representative's too busy, or my reaching out isn't going to make a difference. But because these representatives aren't hearing from constituents as often, it sounds like then every letter, every call, you could argue, has a much bigger impact than it would otherwise.
Yeah, and I think especially when it's coming from not the people they expect. And there's also the potential that the government changes. And if a conservative government under the current leader, Pierre Poilievre, came into power, they would repeal a lot of this.
Right.
Maybe not everything, but a lot of it. And so I think part of what Canadians need to do, regardless of which party they support and how they want to vote, if you're in favor of these policies, folks in office need to know that climate policies need to be sticky. We want them around.
And I'm guessing you would say is that you don't need to be well versed on these things. It could be as simple
No.
as saying, I like the clean energy mandate, or I like whatever it is, and I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of it is that maybe you're not interested in climate change, but you don't like smog. Well, policies aren't that different, right?
Right.
I mean, one of the things I always think about electric vehicles is that beyond all of their the value of them not contributing to climate change to the same degree, not contributing to air pollution to the same degree, they're also just quiet and more pleasant to be in and to drive, right? Like, there's a lot of reasons to argue for them.
Yeah. Cheaper to operate, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and cheaper to operate for sure. Yeah.
Well, Simon, certainly learned a lot about Canada. Hope our listeners outside of Canada and maybe within Canada did as well. And excited to hear that Canada's on the right path. I mean, obviously, more we can do, and we need to do it faster. But there's certainly I get a sense of momentum there, which is great to hear about. And if people pick up that phone or send that letter, it sounds like we can help build upon that.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jason. Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about the path Canada's on. I do worry about the effect of a change in government if it were to happen. And I do worry about how we're going to deal with the oil industry, just given political challenges within the country.
Yeah, we certainly haven't relinquished our desire to extract more fossil fuels yet in the U.S. either. But I think each person saying something about it definitely goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks, Simon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason.
So I don't know about you guys, but I was definitely impressed, obviously, with Simon's interview, his breadth of knowledge. But I also really appreciated, the discussion of courage as opposed to just optimism. Obviously, we're very much about optimists here for obvious reasons. The courage thing resonated for me because I think, in truth, it takes courage for some of us to make these leaps, right? Taking the time to write our legislators who represent us and say, hey, this is important to me. Because if we all have a little bit of that courage and we all make an effort, it definitely has an impact. What do you guys think? Any cool takeaways, thoughts?
Oh, I definitely agree with the courage piece. I mean, especially giving up privileges that some of us have gotten to enjoy for a while. Like the small one that comes to mind is eating meat, and like I think there's, people are making it easier and easier for us to do that with these alternatives, but yeah, I mean, it's a courageous thing to let go of something that is comfortable and that you enjoy. So, I liked that a lot.
Very true. And, that's as individuals, right? We all can't do it by ourselves, but being able to be that change for our friends and family is, that has a knock on impact.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jason. And that accountability piece, which is definitely easier when you've got other people doing it, is something that we obviously also see at the scale of nations. And I was thinking a lot about this 30/30 plan that Simon talks about in his interview. And it kind of is just, that macro scale telling your friends to, cut down their emissions.
To step up.
Um, exactly, to step up. But it is non-binding, which Simon brought up, and so I don't know, I feel like it's interesting to be setting these targets, it's important to be setting these targets, but at that scale, I do wish we had a little more, yeah, legislative accountability, so I'll be interested to see where they go with that in the future.
Yeah, and the problem with this whole non-binding situation, it doesn't provide certainty for businesses, right? Like they want to see a
Mhm.
runway that they can launch down to go and build a new battery plant or set up a new whatever it might be, invest in efficiency because they need to know that's going to put them ahead in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do think that like industry piece is really interesting because when I was reading about it, I read this article by the University of British Columbia talking about, this goal of conserving 30% of the earth by 2030. And there's this really interesting idea that like the land that would be conserved is not all land that's, the middle of a forest. A lot of the places that have important resources, like fresh water, are
Yeah.
places that right now are being used for agriculture, planting. People are living and working in these areas. But yeah, I'm excited to see. I hope that countries will stick to it and, possibly do it in a more binding way in the future.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a good start. I mean, it's similar, obviously, to the Paris Accord, right? These are non-binding. So whether we're talking about conserving these wild places so that we can halt
Mhm.
biodiversity loss, hopefully, or whether we're talking about reducing carbon, unfortunately, the constructs right now are non-binding. But
Mhm.
I think it goes back to the being able to put pressure on your neighbors, and I think there's ways to put pressure that way. And I will say about the carbon price in Canada is that, to their credit, they have one. And I would argue their construct, not totally unbiased here, but their construct is a great one, which is that we're going to put a price on carbon and it's going to increase the cost of all the things that, fuel, heating oil, et cetera, that have carbon in it. And then we're going to, be able to provide, they call it incentive payments, to families to be able to deal with that increasing cost. And, in Canada today, you've got a carbon price of $65, still pretty modest, but that equates to about 60 cents a gallon on gasoline, which isn't nothing. In the US, people would be throwing up their hands if it was 60 cents more expensive. And by the time you get to, 2030, when the carbon price is going to be 170 a ton, then all of a sudden the price of gasoline has crept up $1.50 a gallon. And so you really have the price signal in place to drive different behavior, but at the same time, you're not disadvantaging folks that don't have the income, right? That energy costs are a bigger part of their expenses. I really like the model. And I think, once people get a bigger and bigger payment, it's then hard to sort of pull the rug out on that. It creates some resiliency there, which I think is good.
And I think part of that ties back to the fact that in Canada you've got some great examples of really low carbon emissions societies and technologies. So I think if there was just a little more exchange of or realization that hey, look, in places like Montreal, we're doing things really well. We're building our cities so that we're not dependent on massive gas guzzling vehicles, and we build our houses with great efficiency standards. And I mean, I look at these cold places in the world and we're like, oh, well, we've got to be dependent upon heating oil and so forth to keep the places warm. And it's like, well, actually, look at Iceland and places like that where they're like, well, how can we tap into other sources around us, be it geothermal hot rocks or be it wind
Mm.
turbines. There's always something that you can do if you're just a little bit more creative.
Yeah. The other quick thing I think that's worth pointing out or acknowledging, given the current state of affairs, is the wildfire season in Canada,
Mm.
worst on record. And you have the situation where you've got fires in eastern provinces, which is very atypical. I mean, in the western, United States, Western Canada, we're more used to wildfire, right? It's more typical in our drier climate. But the fact that that's happening now in eastern Canada and that you have a fire season where so many acres have burned so early just illustrates how, a country like Canada is seeing these climate impacts. Really it's sort of climate impacts on steroids, right? They're seeing it much
Mhm.
sooner and more dramatically.
Yeah, I can't help but think about what Simon was already talking about with the atmospheric rivers. I mean, some of the stats on that are just wild. In general, huge climate buzzword, but atmospheric river AR is this big stream of water vapor that can drop a month's worth of precipitation in a few days. And, Lewis, you're talking about fires, and those are kind of only worsening the effects of these ARs because all of a sudden, the plants that would be taking all this runoff and repurposing it are, burned out. So pretty scary stuff.
Yeah. And I guess great motivation for being able to, you know, tighten the screws on these climate measures, right? So that we're doing more faster. And I think while these situations are obviously very tragic, let's not let them go to waste, right? Let's use them as a call to action and to,
Hmm.
hold the government more accountable.
I think along those lines too, the impact of those fires and the smoke moving all the way to the east coast and down the east coast into places like New York, it's definitely been an eye opener for those communities that like, wow, the effect we've been having on the planet is real, and it there are issues that are going to be impacting us. The fact that we can't walk outside and breathe decent air anymore. I mean, it's a terrible situation, but it's good that the public are now becoming aware of the impact of our emissions.
Yeah, it's true. And Simon brought up the point that there's a bit of a fear behind these events that drives all this environmental interest, and he's kind of worried about this idea of, once the event goes away, some of the lasting impacts are gone, people kind of forget and lose that motivation. And what's scary is that I think that's becoming less and less of a problem because we're having more and more events. Like you look at any major news source and you can find somewhere globally some climate event that is really shaking people.
Yeah, all the more reason to use it as a catalyst to, push on elected officials to strengthen targets, right?
Absolutely.
Strengthen policies rather. And that kind of leads to our what can we do? And I hear that somebody on the team actually wrote a letter. We weren't going to do,
Woo!
we weren't going to do a segment this week on what have you done for the climate, but rumor has it that somebody wrote a letter to their elected officials. We always got to celebrate these.
Mhm.
It was a follow up on the environmental justice one. I wrote a letter to our local transit authority here and was like, "Hey, I see diesel buses everywhere. Like, what are your plans on making the switch?" And it turns out there is a plan.
Oh,
I don't know
That's
how
good.
much of this plan I'm allowed to announce, but yeah, one city they're going to be doing a trial with 2 electric buses, and yeah, the other major city in Tasmania, they're going to be doing a trial with 3 hydrogen buses, which actually made me a little bit sad. So I'm like, look, here's why the battery bus is a really good idea and why it's not necessary for us to reinvent the wheel down here. Let's just look at what others have already done. Anyway, we'll see what happens. But it's great that they're getting there, and it's also great that like I get the feeling where you get a response from somebody. You put the effort into writing the letter, and somebody stepped up to the plate and wrote a response, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I mean that's perfect, and that's really what we want to ask folks to do this week. The Trudeau administration is wants to pump about 12 billion in tax incentives into the oil and gas sector to help them implement carbon capture technology. And while that might sound good on the surface, right, reducing that from our lens, at least mine, it's just prolonging the burning of fossil fuels. And so what we want to do is have folks email Trudeau and tell him to abandon, this idea of tax incentives for oil and gas, and instead, you know, put those towards places where you have much more predictable and permanent solutions like, building heating and on future industries, right? Things like solar, batteries, etc. So, as always, we'll have talking points on our website. We'll have a link there to email Trudeau's office, but, encourage obviously all our Canadian listeners to send a note. And, remember, as Simon says, it doesn't take as many notes as you think it would. And it's all about having, regular folks who are concerned about climate change be heard by their government. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thanks for tuning in. With the 4th of July holiday coming up here in the U.S., we won't be releasing our next episode until July 11th. In the meantime, get out there and do something bold for the climate. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.